Ja, god dag, kjære seere. Vi ønsker dere velkommen tilbake til oss her i Frikanalen, til Trond Alis kvarter. I fokus er fortsatt Israel, som vel spiller en ganske så sentral rolle i Midtøstens problemer, det må man vel kunne si. Vi tar opp spørsmål om noen ideologier i dag som er knyttet til staten Israel. Den ene ideologien er sionisme, en politisk ideologi som er grunnlaget for staten Israel, slik det slås fast i Israels egen uavhengighetserklæring. Sionisme, politisk ideologi, grunnlag for staten Israel. På den ene siden, den ene ideologien, måte å tenke på. Den andre er antisemitisme. Jødehat. Og spørsmålet er om disse to måter å være på, å tenke på, to ideologier, henger sammen på noe vis. Er antisionisme antisemitisme? Det er et viktig spørsmål. Vi bør være litt skolert i dette og ha kunnskaper om det. Så det er vårt aktuelle tema i dag, og vi overlater egentlig den debatten om det til et større møte som ble holdt i England for en tid tilbake. 4 debattanter. Påstanden som ble stilt i utgangspunktet, den påstanden var: er antisionisme antisemitisme? Og mer enn det. Det vil altså stilt som en påstand. Er antisionisme antisemittisme? Temaene ble diskutert og endte opp med en avstemning blant de som var til stede. Så følg gjerne med dere også. Her overlater vi ordet om disse temaene til debattantene på møtet i London.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to you all, and echoing Hannah's apologies for a slightly late start. It is great to see such a full house for this debate, and the motion of our debate tonight. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There is so much meaning packed into those words. Meaning which stretches down the centuries and meaning which reaches into the lives of millions of people today. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, these terms are very fraught. Anti-Zionism, often defined as opposition to the existence of a state, of a Jewish state in the territory defined as the historic land of Israel or Palestine. I'll repeat that. Often defined as opposition to the existence of a Jewish state in the territory defined as the historic land of Israel or Palestine. Anti-Semitism, most often defined as hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews. Now, surveys suggest that Israel is one of the most disliked nations in the world, along with Iran and North Korea. But how much of this is driven by policies of the Israeli state, and how much is a cover for age-old hatred of the Jews? These are the questions we will examine this evening. So, let's go to our first speaker for the motion, Melanie Phillips, who is a journalist, broadcaster, and author. She has a weekly column in the Times newspaper. She writes for the Jerusalem Post and Jewish Chronicle. Melanie, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I never visited Israel at all until the year 2000, and I never wanted to go there. It didn't sound the kind of place which had anything to offer me. So, when in the year 2000 I objected as a matter of sheer rationality and justice that while Israelis were being blown to bits in buses and cafes during what was called the Second Intifada, they were being called Nazis for dealing with the perpetrators, I was astounded to be immediately attacked as a Jew. I was accused immediately of dual loyalty, of being too Jewish, and of waving the shroud of the Holocaust to sanitize the crimes of Israel. Well, I think you can see the same pattern in today's Labour Party crisis over anti-Semitism, in which anti-Semitic motifs about Jewish global conspiracies are conflated with attacks on Israel. At one meeting, Jeremy Corbyn noted of two Zionist opponents in the audience that despite, quote, having lived in this country for a very long time, they don't understand English irony, using the smear that as British Jews, they didn't actually belong in Britain. The Palestine Solidarity campaign is riddled with anti-Semitic comments such as that the Paris Bataclan massacre was a false flag operation to increase support for Israel, or that Kristallnacht was instigated by communist and Freemason Jews to promote war against Germany. Today, a German neo-Nazi group has linked to the BDS movement, noting with approval its efforts to isolate the Zionist aggressor state in defense of the rights of Palestinian people. The language of BDS and the far right is interchangeable. Those who say anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism would have us believe that all this is simply a coincidence. I say it is not, and that anti-Zionism is weaponizing anti-Semitism, and this is why. Let's define, first of all, what we're talking about. What is Zionism? Nothing more or less than the self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland of Israel. What is anti-Semitism? A delusional hatred and fear of Jews, Judaism, or the Jewish people. But anti-Semitism is not like other prejudices. It has unique characteristics applied to no other group, people, or cause, such as an obsessional and unhinged narrative based entirely on lies, accusing Jews of crimes of which they are not only innocent but the victims, holding them to standards expected of no one else, depicting them as global conspiracy of unique malice and power. Amazing, anti-Zionism has exactly the same characteristics. Don't get me wrong, criticism of Israel's policies, robust criticism, is entirely legitimate. But anti-Zionism is different. Anti-Zionism demonizes, dehumanizes, and delegitimizes Israel in order to bring about its destruction. You may hear some of this slander this evening. The lie, for example, that Israel's an apartheid state, when Israeli Arabs have equal civil and religious rights. The lie of ethnic cleansing, when the Arab population in the disputed territories has more than quadrupled since Israel's rebirth in 1948. The lie that the Israelis are willful child killers, when they in fact go to unique lengths to avoid killing civilians in their always defensive wars, and when the ratio of civilians to fighters that the Israelis kill is at least 3 or 4 times better than any other country, including Britain. The lie of Israel's human rights violations, when it's the only country in the Middle East where Arab Muslims and Christians, women and gays can live in freedom and safety. Fundamentally, anti-Zionism is based on the big lie that the Jews seized and occupied another people's land. But history and law show that's completely untrue. The Jews are the only extant indigenous people of the land. Israel was their kingdom more than 3,000 years ago. Driven out when it was occupied, they maintained a continuous presence in the land under the waves of colonialism, Assyrian, Roman, Abbasid, Mamluk, Ottoman, the British. They fought off Arab colonialists to re-establish their state in 1948 and are still fighting off Arab colonialism. The Palestine Mandate of 1922, which parceled out the former Ottoman Empire, enshrined their right to settle throughout that land, a right that endures unaltered in international law. The law also entitles Israel to hold on to land seized from its attackers, while that land remains the launchpad for attacks, demonstrably true. The Jews are therefore fully entitled to live in both Israel and the disputed territories, even though they have always agreed to share it with those Arabs who lay a claim to it. But the Palestinians have refused to share it and have responded to repeated offers of a state of their own with terrorism and war. Israel is the only place where Jewish peoplehood makes sense, but anti-Zionism singles out the Jewish people alone as having no right to their homeland. Of course, many groups aspire to a homeland, but Israel is not an aspiration. Israel is a country. No other actual country is singled out for destruction and the mass murder that would inescapably follow. No one tells the Kurds, for example, their aspiration to a homeland is illegitimate and racist. People say Zionism is racism because of the big lie the Jews stole the land. Anti-Zionism thus writes the Jews uniquely out of their own history, It is an anti-Jewish calumny. Now, people say anti-Zionism can't be anti-Semitism because some Jews are anti-Zionist. Very true. But in fact, there have always been Jewish anti-Semites, Karl Marx, to name but one, who wrote, quote, "The emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism." Yes, a small fringe of ultra-Orthodox Jews campaigns against the state of Israel, but they nevertheless pray every day that the Jews should return to live in Zion free of foreign rule. Their beef is they think the return in Israel is premature and should happen under different conditions, so their problem is a matter of timing. What they do not believe is the core doctrine of anti-Semitism, that the Jews have no right to the land of Israel. Now, there's a vital distinction to be made between anti-Semites and anti-Semitism. Many, many decent people believe these lies about Israel out of ignorance or ideology. That does not make them necessarily anti-Semites. But the discourse they endorse is still anti-Semitism's current mutation. Moreover, by supporting Palestinianism, they are supporting not just anti-Zionism, but anti-Semitism too. The Palestinians' real agenda, not two states, but exterminating Israel and replacing it by Palestine, as they repeatedly have told us over the years, is based on an anti-Jewish animus. The evidence of this is all around. Mahmoud Abbas's doctorate in Holocaust denial, his hero worship of the 1930s Grand Mufti in Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who made a pact with Hitler to exterminate every Jew in the Middle East, the grotesque Nazi-style imagery of Palestinian propaganda, such as sermons claiming the Jews are the fabricators of history, who dance and live on the body parts of others, there is no global corruption their rabbis did not allow, Palestinian claims that the Jews are behind 9/11 and that they control the world's media, finance, and US foreign policy. This unhinged, murderous anti-Semitism drives the Palestinian cause. Does anyone therefore seriously suggest that people in this country who support this cause and who say that the Jews were behind 9/11 and controlled the world's media, finance, and US foreign policy, that this really is just a coincidence? And if our opponents this evening really do believe anti-Zionism is free from anti-Semitism, will they denounce this Palestinian agenda of genocidal, Nazi-style Jew hatred? This is not an academic debate. When I grew up in London, anti-Semitism was confined to a few nutters on the fringes who were treated as pariahs, and now it's been legitimized. Not surprisingly, anti-Semitic attacks are running at record levels, and what's so distressing is to hear our right as Jews to our own peoplehood being singled out as illegitimate, and to hear the unhinged and obsessional lies and distortions about Israel become the default position of fashionable conversation. And then, on top of that, then to be told that the claim that people like myself make that these are anti-Semitic conspiracy theories is itself a conspiracy got up by the Israel embassy. And it's supposed to be we Jews who have no sense of English irony. Anti-Semitism, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, always attacks Jews as a collective. First, it attacked us as a religion. Then it attacked us as a race of people. Now it attacks us as a people, as the collective Jew in Israel, with exactly the same characteristics as Jew hatred through the centuries. The aim to be free of Jews now takes the form of the aim to be free of the Jewish state. Anti-Zionists treat Israel as the Jew among nations, to be uniquely vilified, slandered, and exterminated. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Melanie. So now, our first speaker against the motion, Ilan Pappé, is an Israeli historian, an anti-Zionist activist, a professor at the University of Exeter. He has challenged traditional versions of Israeli history. Ilan Pappé, you have the floor for 10 minutes.
The equation that is being put in front of you tonight is both outrageous and ridiculous. If only because it makes every Palestinian in the world, almost everyone who lives in the Arab and Muslim world, anyone who regards themselves as liberal or on the left, it turns all these people into anti-Semites. Whereas quite a few people who regard themselves as Zionists, like the Christian Zionists, are actually anti-Semites themselves. But it is important to challenge it because it was used with some effect to stifle the debate on Palestine in the West. This allegation is used in order to prevent the promotion for positions of power of politicians known for the long-term support for Palestine. By defaming these politicians as anti-Semitic, official Israel and its supporters worldwide hope to bring them down, as in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, or delegitimize them, as in the case of Ilhan Omar in the American Congress. So this is a good opportunity and an appropriate venue to say loud and clear that if you are against Zionism, or if you define yourself as I do and anti-Zionist, you are not anti-Semite, or in my case, a self-hating Jew, which my doctors told me is an incurable disease and I would have to live with for the rest of my life. I will make 5 points, one long one and 4 or 5 short ones. Anti-Semitism is an old, ugly attitude that demonizes Jews because of who they are and led in the past to horrendous policies of discrimination and genocide. It still prevails today, and despite the passing of years, it's basically not changed much. Its origins are deeply rooted in the Christian faith and were adopted in more recent years by right-wing supremacists and some extreme Islamic groups. Anti-Zionism, on the other hand, is a new phenomenon, as is Zionism, and dates back to the 1820s, when, as you know, Zionism began as a Christian project before it was a Jewish project. And then it was part of an internal debate within evangelical Christianity. Anti-Zionism then was a moral position against romantic nationalism and Christian fundamentalism that today we call Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is an evangelical belief that the return of the Jews to Palestine would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the conversion of the Jews to Christianity or their barbecuing in hell. Now, these barbecuing Christians, who are very important, are anti-Semites who want to get rid of all the Jews they don't like and get in return the only Jew they want, Jesus Christ. It's a double bill. They are today the most important base of President Trump and his ilk, and they are the most important Zionists in the US, providing immunity for Israeli policies on the ground. When Jewish activists and intellectuals adopted Zionism in response to anti-Semitism in the late 19th century, their antagonists were mainly other Jews. They were either Orthodox Jews who saw a premature return to Palestine as tampering with the will of God and regarded as a heresy the substitution of rich monotheistic religion with the ideologically poor modern idea of romantic nationalism. So they were definitely not anti-Semites. Other Jews believed that supporting universal ideologies such as liberalism or socialism would be the answer, and if they had to move geographically from anti-Semitic environments, they preferred to go somewhere else, mainly to the US, but not only to the US. They were also not anti-Semites. When Zionism became a settler colonial movement on the ground with the building of Jewish colonies in late Ottoman Palestine and during the British Mandate, the Palestinian national movement perceived Zionism as an existential threat to the indigenous people of Palestine, a fear that turned to be valid, as transpired with the 1948 ethnic cleansing of the people of Palestine during the Nakba. Opposing the Jewish settlers and their plans for the Palestinians' homeland was not anti-Semitic, but anti-colonialist, very much as the Algerians objected to the colonization of Algeria. A small group of the Jewish settlers became anti-Zionist themselves when they consented to live within Arab Palestine as guests, but not as colonizers, as was advocated to them by Mahatma Gandhi in the 1930s, and because of that position, he was never honored with a street named after him in Israel, not even a small passway or a staircase. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, anti-Zionism as an anti-colonialist ideology continued to inform the Palestinian national movement's vision and strategy, as is manifested in the PLO National Charter, that called for the establishment of a democratic secular state in Palestine that would respect all three religions. In Israel itself, the Communist Party, supported almost exclusively by the Palestinian minority inside Israel, not because of the communist ideology, but because it was the only anti-Zionist party Israel allowed to exist, They regarded Zionism as an ideology of discrimination and apartheid. Most scholars today looking at Israel then and today agree that this is a valid point, which again has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. 2, in our century, anti-Zionism is a moral position against the Israeli structural violence directed at the Palestinians, which is attributed by anti-Zionists such as myself to an ideology that is not only endangering the very existence of the Palestinians, but is also very bad for the Jews who live outside or inside Israel. This ideology generates anti-Semitism. Opposing it might bring it down. In our century, anti-Zionism is a scholarly position, a moral stance, and a vision for the future. As a scholarly position, it frames Zionism as settler colonialism, similar to European settlers movement who went to the Americas, South Africa, and Australia, encountering indigenous people and removing them in order to create new homelands for themselves. It's a moral stance that rejects an ideology that imposes an apartheid system inside Israel, a military occupation in the West Bank, and siege on the Gaza ghetto. It's a vision for the future of a democratic state for all, by restoring justice to the land, by respecting United Nations Resolution 194, calling for the unconditional return of the Palestinian refugees expelled in 1948 and since the Nakba. This may be a utopian view, but it's not an anti-Zionist one, anti-Semitic one. 3, for those who claim that anti-Zionism is a refusal to recognize the right of Israel to exist, we should say that states do not exist by right. They are founded by historical processes, and they become a fait accompli. The debate is about the nature of the state and the regime. We are all entitled to wish for and work for a better, more just, and egalitarian state for everyone who lives in Israel and Palestine, and for those who were expelled from there. 4, in 1975, a vast majority of the United Nations member states defined Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. It was passed with the same majority that passed the 1947 resolution recognizing Israel. The difference was that in 1947, the colonized world was not represented in the United Nations. In 1975, it was. But it was still trying to find its way in the post-colonial world. The Third World's discourse equated Zionism with continued colonialism. Alas, neoliberalism, corruption, and post-colonial political system, corruption in the post-colonial political system, and aggressive American imperialism have casted to the sideways of history this impulse and energy. But at its height and within it, anti-Zionism was part of the wish of the colonized people to build a better and more just world. Again, nothing to do with anti-Zionism, with anti-Semitism. When the 1975 resolution was revoked in 1991, the debate on Zionism entered a new phase, its present phase. After the horrific events in 9/11 and the so-called war and terror, the Israeli Hasbara invented the threat of a new anti-Semitism. This was the only way to repel the moral outrage people around the world felt towards the policies of incremental genocide in the Gaza Strip and the brutal oppression of the West Bank. If you voiced criticism against these policies, you were depicted as a new anti-Semite, and the Israeli academia was recruited to provide scholarly scaffolding for such an accusation. The Western elites bought or were intimidated into buying this false allegation. But the civil society, and in particular the younger generation, reject with disgust this attempt to silence them. They know enough to call the bluff and understand the full meaning of solidarity with the Palestinians. They demonstrate in the streets, in their campuses, and join the Palestinians on the ground at a personal cost to show how outrageous it is to call the pure struggle for justice anti-Semitic. If you are an anti-Zionist today, you are not only standing firmly on a sound moral base in condemning this ideology that generates all these crimes, you are also expressing your disgust at the hypocrisy of your government, mainstream media, and academia. We will not be silenced by false accusation of anti-Semitism, and neither should the British Labour Party be intimidated by cynical media without a moral backbone or sinister legislation efforts utilizing a justified struggle against terror in order to provide immunity to Palestine's colonizers and oppressors. Finally, the Labour Party is responsible in many ways for the debate we have today. We all know that the so-called revelation of institutional racism, institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party began not on the day that Corbyn was elected as a leader, but after 2 attempts to depose him and failed. Then suddenly the campaign emerged. I know the force of this campaign of intimidation. I face it myself. It is ugly, unfair, and destabilizing. But the proud party with the historical role of defeating fascism in this country in the 1930s should not so easily succumb to false allegation of anti-Semitism. Finally, we should retake, five sentences. Let us retake the conversation and prioritize it. Let us discuss how to stop the destruction of Palestine and the Palestinians, which the Trump's deal of the century wants to do. Let us fight violent fanaticism wherever we encounter it. Uproot racism of all kinds without building a hierarchy of victims and remove silly and outrageous equations like the one titling the event tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan.
Ja, kjære seere, vi håper dere har fulgt denne debatten, første del av den. Spennende tanker og holdninger, litt å lære av, bli klok på, håper vi. Vi håper dere har hatt utbytte og nytte av denne første sendingen vår om dette temaet. Vi følger opp med fortsettelse om 1 eller 2-3 dager i samme program. Så følg med her i Frikanalen, Trond Alis kvarter, og vi sier takk til dere for å ha fulgt oss i dag. Velkommen tilbake til oss.